To start off today, you will be hearing from me in terms of a little bit of information about human synergistics, the history of the company, our model, as well as the suite of assessments that we use. After this, you'll be hearing from Dr. Cook, and then we'll turn the time over to our accredited consultants and really see how they use the tools in practice. So to begin today, introducing human synergistics, I really believe that our company can be best thought of as what it really is, a research-based organization. We were founded by Dr. Clay Lafferty, a clinical psychologist, over 40 years ago, and since that time, we've really been working to better understand the ways in which individuals, groups, teams, managers, leaders, and in fact, broad organizations function effectively. Dr. Lafferty, originally as a clinical psychologist, became very interested in understanding the ways in which individual effectiveness are impacted or driven by the ways in which individuals think and behave, something that we call personal styles. At that time, in the very early 1970s, this was actually quite a new concept. At that time, things like personality, experiential data, level of education, these sorts of things were well understood to impact how effectively individuals perform, both within and outside of organizations. But the concept of using thinking and behavior was actually kind of a new idea. I think, hopefully today, we can understand the concept that the ways in which individuals think and behave must have some impact upon how effective they are, again, both inside and outside of organizations. However, unlike personality and many of these other measures, Dr. Lafferty, as a clinical psychologist, saw behavior and thinking as something that not only could be driving outcomes of effectiveness, but by their nature could be developed and coached in an effort ultimately to help people to become more effective in what they do, more satisfied. So we can understand, if we can understand how individuals think and behave and how that impacts their effectiveness, then really our first 360-degree behaviorally based tool, the Lifestyles Inventory, or LSI, could also be used as a launching point for coaching and development efforts to help individuals to become more satisfied, more effective within organizations and other contexts. When Dr. Lafferty began designing the LSI, one of the things that was necessary is not only to measure outcomes of effectiveness, but also to be able to represent behavior and thinking styles in a way that is intuitive for individuals so that they can understand the feedback that they're receiving. And he therefore collaborated with Dr. Cook to begin creating a model to represent those behaviors for the LSI tool. The model that Human Synergistics has created, we today call the CIrcumplex. It is a circular diagram that orients the 12 behavioral styles personal styles that we look at with the LSI. On this model, behavioral styles are organized in several different ways. We've tried to do this in a way that is intuitive and also represents the empirical data and research behind the tool, as well as some of the underlying psychological theory that led to its development. The first way in which the tool is designed really is that the styles of the CIrcumplex are placed closer together in the cases where they are more similar to one another. And as the behaviors become increasingly dissimilar, they are placed increasingly further from one another until by the time you reach essentially opposite styles on the CIrcumplex, you really are looking at behaviors that are opposite to some extent by definition and in fact negatively correlated. The next way in which the CIrcumplex was really modeled is we wanted to give again some intuitive framework to the tool. So there were two primary dimensions that were used. The first is to orient these behaviors in terms of individual needs. Essentially, we can think of each of the 12 styles as being exhibited by individuals in an effort to fulfill some type of personal need. In this case, the simple distinction that we are making is between what we would call higher order needs, or needs that have to do with satisfaction and growth, and lower order needs that have more to do with security, safety, and self-protection. Grouping needs in this way of course, originates from Abraham Maslow and his very well-known hierarchy of needs model. Much like Maslow, we also orient those behaviors which are security-oriented toward the bottom of the model, and those behaviors which are those styles which are more satisfaction-oriented toward the top. The second dimension that we use in terms of giving additional structure to the model and intuitive framework has to do with tasks versus people orientation. And this is a very simple division. A lot of research and psychological theory, especially in the areas of management and leadership, draws a very, very basic distinction in terms of thinking and behavioral styles between whether these are carried out primarily to fulfill tasks or whether they are carried out primarily to work with other people, interpersonal behaviors. This distinction was found very early on to be very intuitive and helpful to add further structure to the model. And so in terms of the CIrcumplex, those behaviors on the left-hand side are more task-oriented, while those on the right-hand side are more people-oriented. So those are the two dimensions that were used to orient those 12 styles. However, the next thing that we really found was that over the years, we found that the 12 behavioral styles can really be classified into 3 more general categories. And these categories are based not only on statistical analysis in terms of how they relate to one another, but also in terms of their impact on effectiveness, because the lifestyles inventory, the CIrcumplex originally, was really designed to look at these behaviors in terms of or in the context of effectiveness. What we find is that each of these 3 clusters of 4 behaviors have very different ways in which they impact or drive effectiveness. So that has become a very important aspect of the model to understand. I'm actually, for time and time reasons, I'm not going to get into the style level descriptions of all 12 styles. The important thing today is to understand primarily these 3 clusters and how they drive levels of effectiveness. But just to help you further, we did also include in your packet, there is a CIrcumplex model in the German language, 2-sided with additional information at the style level descriptions. So if you're curious, you can dig in there and find that information as well. We have termed these clusters based on their shared characteristics. The first one that I'm going to talk about are the passive defensive behavioral styles. And these styles are style 3, approval, style 4, conventional, 5, dependence, and 6, avoidance. These we can see from the model itself that these behaviors are primarily oriented toward the bottom of the CIrcumplex. They are behaviors exhibited in order to fulfill needs of protection, safety, and security. They are also oriented on the right-hand side of the model, which indicates that these are primarily interpersonal type of behaviors. When we look at this cluster of styles, really, in terms of research, what we find is something very important, and that is that the passive defensive styles have very consistent correlations and associations with negative outcomes. That is to say, the extent to which individuals exhibit these behaviors tends to be associated with outcomes such as increased levels of stress, lower levels of motivation, engagement, and satisfaction, difficulty effectively solving problems, and so on. So purely from an empirical standpoint, Human Synergistics as a company really looks at development in terms of these assessments and would tend to recommend that individuals really be coached away from using or relying upon passive defensive behaviors purely based on their association with outcomes of effectiveness. Moving to the left side of the model, we have what we've termed the aggressive defensive behaviors. Again, in this case, these styles are oriented toward the bottom of the CIrcumplex, so these primarily have to do with the fulfillment of safety and security needs. In this case, however, we're primarily talking about task-oriented behavior, so these are ways in which individuals approach tasks or work in order to fulfill their own safety, security position, especially within organizational contexts. In terms of, the styles that we're talking about are style 7, oppositional, 8, power, 9, competitive, and 10, perfectionistic. And again, if you want a little bit more descriptors in terms of what we're talking about, you do have that information. Again, in terms of the research and what we find these behavioral styles to be associated with, in the case of the aggressive defensive styles, the impact is different from the passive defensive. In this case, what we find is that the association between these styles and effectiveness is somewhat mixed, variable, or even unpredictable. At times, we find that the aggressive defensive styles are positively associated with outcomes that we would classify as being positive, things like increased salary or being promoted at an earlier time. While at the same time, however, these styles tend to be associated with many other negative outcomes, such as increased levels of stress, lower levels of motivation, satisfaction, difficulty, or lower levels of effectiveness in solving problems or working interpersonally in groups and teams, and so on. So ultimately, when discussing the aggressive defensive styles, we also see not only, for the most part, they tend to be associated with negative outcomes, but especially when we look at them over the long term. So again, from kind of an empirical standpoint, human synergistics really takes the position of, for individual levels, really coaching individuals away from relying upon aggressive defensive types of behavior. This, of course, brings us to the third cluster, which we've termed constructive. The constructive styles really differentiate themselves from both passive defensive and aggressive defensive in 3 fundamental and really important ways. The first way is that the constructive styles are satisfaction-oriented. They are oriented toward the top of the CIrcumplex model and have to do with the fulfillment of individual satisfaction needs for growth, development, learning, improving oneself, these sorts of things. The next thing that we can tell about the constructive styles from the model is that they bridge both the task and people-oriented side, so that when we look at them, we can see that it's possible to approach tasks in a way that is constructive, and it's also possible to approach people in terms of interpersonal behaviors and styles in a way that is constructive as well. The styles that we're talking about are style 11, achievement, style 12, self-actualizing, the 1 o'clock position moving more toward the interpersonal side, we have humanistic encouraging, and finally, at the 2 o'clock position, we have affiliative. Now, the third and final way that these styles, the constructive styles, differentiate themselves from all others, really, is probably the most important, and that is that constructive styles are consistently and very predictably associated and correlated with outcomes of effectiveness. So that is, again, to say the extent to which individuals think and behave in constructive ways tends to be strongly associated with positive outcomes like lower levels of stress, increased motivation, satisfaction, engagement, higher levels of problem-solving effectiveness, the ability to work more effectively in teams and groups, and so on. So again, from a very research-driven perspective, human synergistics really does promote the concept of developing, growing, and promoting constructive behaviors, ultimately based upon their association with effectiveness. Now, this model has proven to be very, very helpful in describing individual behavior, and that is how I've used it up until this point in the presentation. What we're looking at, or have looked at, is the way in which this model can be applied to individual level thinking and behaviors and then associated with outcomes of effectiveness. It's a very nice model for this, and it's been used since the very early 1970s in this way, and we continue to use it with thousands of lifestyles inventories around the world every year. However, a number of years ago, beginning in about 1980, human synergistics, I would honestly say, went through almost a revolution in terms of our company scope and vision. And this really all originated from Dr. Cook beginning to look at this CIrcumplex model from a much broader perspective than the individual level. So you might almost think of it as sort of a social psychological perspective rather than the clinical psychological perspective that led to the development of the LSI. From that perspective, individuals can be seen as being part of a broader group. Individual behavior, the way in which people work together, can be seen not only in terms of individuals, but also in terms of groups, and ultimately broad organizations, and even beyond organizations in terms of society. So from that systems perspective, in other words, if we can apply this model effectively at the individual level, that would seem to indicate that it may be applicable to broader levels within the same system. If we therefore can understand the ways in which individuals are effective, these constructive styles, then we should be able to apply, again, the same model, those same styles, to broader groups in order to understand how groups, teams, and organizations can work effectively. And that is actually what we have found. So while human synergistics started over 40 years ago with an individual level assessment to develop more effective individuals, what we have effectively done over the past 4 decades is apply this model to an entire organizational system to understand how things take place within organizations at different levels and actually even beyond. If you can actually please look into your conference packet, hopefully you should be able to find a handout that looks something like this. On your handout, on one side, you have in German the levels of the system that we are referring to. On the other side of the handout, you will have the title and name of the Human Synergistics Assessment, which was designed to measure that aspect of the system. This can be a little complicated, so I think this model that Dr. Cook has provided for our conference last year is really quite helpful. I'm actually going to start somewhat in the center of the model. I'm highlighting it so that it's clear in English, entitled Behavioral Norms and Expectations. In terms of the system, this really is the cultural level of the model. We are looking at and measure with our organizational culture inventory the ways in which individuals are expected and reinforced to behave within organizations, and the effectiveness of organizations as well as in several different categories, such as individual aspects of effectiveness, of satisfaction, motivation, engagement, departmental level measures of effectiveness, like how effectively departments function within themselves as well as across departments, and organizational levels of effectiveness, quality, and also we get into areas of customer service. This is really the heart of organizational change. I believe nearly all of the presentations that you will be hearing about today will touch on at least this aspect of the organizational or the system model. This is where really growth and development is sort of the heart of it, because in order for organizations to function more effectively, ultimately we really have to develop more constructive cultures. And in order to develop more constructive cultures, we need to understand what is driving culture within organizations. And to do that, we need to look again at our model, and you can see above culture there are 3 primary contributing factors that we have identified. The first one on the left-hand side is entitled Leader Strategies and Impact. We have recently developed assessments designed specifically to assess individual leaders and their contribution to the organization's culture. We've found, quite simply, that the ways in which leaders fulfill their responsibilities, the ways in which leaders communicate their expectations, have a very profound and important impact on the way in which people function, behave within those organizational contexts. The next section of the model discusses societal values. This is an area of the model that's actually measured by our organizational culture inventory, the ideal version. And what we're looking at in this case is really asking organizational members what the values of the organization are. Specifically to the survey, we're asking in terms of what behaviors should be expected of you in order for you to contribute to the organization effectively as an individual. Next, moving toward the right-hand side, we have a section called Systems, Structures, Technologies, Skills and Qualities. This is measured by what we call our organizational effectiveness inventory. Effectively, what we found is there are approximately 31 dimensions that we have identified which have an impact upon the way in which individuals behave within organizations. This can be things like the way in which power or influence is distributed throughout the organization, the way in which individual organizational members are recognized or rewarded, the ways in which organizational members understand their role or responsibility within the organization. These things are very important and tend to lead to culture and the way in which individuals interact in these companies. So this is assessed with our organizational effectiveness inventory. Moving below the cultural level, we have a section entitled Members' Personal Styles. This is actually looking at the thinking and behavioral styles of individuals. This is the section of the model which is measured by our Lifestyles Inventory, or LSI, that I used to introduce the CIrcumplex model in the first part of my presentation. While it is true, I think it's important to note, while it is of course true that individuals bring their own personality, their own experiences, their own perspective with them as they come into an organization, it can be actually quite shocking the extent to which leadership, culture, and the way in which organizations are structured actually does, in time, influence the way organizational members behave within that organizational context. So understanding these influences on the individual is very important. On the left-hand side, we have a section of the model entitled Subsystems and Group Dynamics. This is the group or team level of the system and is assessed using our Group Styles Inventory, or GSI. Again, each one of these tools not only measures essentially behavioral styles at that systems level, but also outcomes associated with effectiveness that are appropriate to that level of the model. So in the case of Group Styles Inventory, we're looking at things like how effectively groups solve problems, how they manage their time, individual member commitment to the solution, individual member commitment to the team, and so on. Moving to the right side of the model, we have a section entitled Boundary Spanning Dynamics. This is actually quite an interesting area. Because this is a systems model, some of these sections actually extend beyond the organization itself. In the case of the organizational culture inventory or the societal values at the top, that actually is including societal values that change globally, which is something that Dr. Cook will be presenting on in a moment. And in this case as well, in terms of boundary spanning dynamics, we're looking at actually organizational influences or impacts that extend beyond the organization itself. In this case, we're specifically referencing a survey that we call the Customer Service Styles, which really looks at the ways in which the organizations themselves are impacting their customer service and aspects of customer satisfaction. Ultimately, all of these things come together and drive outcomes at each of these at each of the levels within the system, as well as for the system really as a whole. One thing that I would also say is that it's really important to understand, I know I've got all these sort of one-way arrows going on this model, but we need to look at the system really in a much more organic perspective. Each of these levels of the system do have impacts upon each other, and while it is of course true that leadership and culture and the way that we structure organizations has an impact upon the individuals and groups, it's just as true that the individual members of organizations have impacts upon the teams and organizations that they are members of. So it is important to keep this much more organic sort of perspective in mind when we look at how organizations function. Having a suite of assessments is we find to be extremely important, both for consultants as well as organizations, for really two primary reasons. First of all, it can be quite difficult, we found, to affect change and development by only concentrating or focusing on one level of this system. For example, coaching at the individual level to develop individuals to think and behave in more constructive and therefore more effective ways is a very good effort. However, it's important to understand that there may be at the same time influences at the leadership or organizational level, somewhere else in the model, that may be encouraging individuals to behave in other, perhaps somewhat defensive ways. So it's always important to keep that in mind when we're looking at the organization, looking at it from a systems perspective. In fact, you will see that today. We have two very good cases in which organizations began specifically by developing individuals using the LSI, and we have another case where individuals were coached and developed using LWS, which is also at that individual level. And in both cases, the organizations have since realized that in order to do this really effectively and to change the organization, we need to begin looking at other levels of the system and understand how things are impacting each other. The second way in which I think it's very important to have a system is that what we're able to do, therefore, because we are applying the same model at each level, is we're able to give organizations a single model, a single language, a single set of terminology that they can easily learn and grasp and incorporate. This is not only really important, critical for those people who are trying to drive the organizational change, such as hopefully the leadership, human resources, the accredited consultants involved in the project, but it's really also important for the organizational members themselves. This gives them a way to understand what is taking place within their organization and how they as individuals can grow and develop and really contribute to developing the individuals, the groups, and the organizations to become more constructive and therefore more effective. This really altogether is the way in which human synergistics is working for the last 4 decades around the world with organizations to fulfill our own personal company vision and goal of changing the world one organization at a time. Thank you.